Okay, so this is the Bible study for Matthew chapter 12, verses 46 through 50. And the text is very short. Now, I'll say there are also Luke and Mark texts that are there in parentheses. The Luke text largely says the same thing. I think the Mark text uh, shares something a little bit deeper in the way that it explains what was going on in this passage. So we're going to look at that a little bit and kind of glean what we can out of that that may give us some more details about the um, episode, if you will. I've been talking about that some in our study of Matthew. This little episode that happens, we're looking at it, but one of the gospel authors writes something that we aren't told in the other ones, because in the other ones, Jesus makes a comment. I think Mark gives us some insight into why Jesus made that comment and what the meaning of it is. So anyway, that's what we're going to look at. Um, the text says in Matthew 12, it says, while Jesus was still talking to the crowd, his mother and brothers stood outside wanting to speak to him. Someone told him, your mother and brothers are standing outside wanting to speak to you. He replied to him, who is my mother and who are my brothers? Pointing to his disciples, he said, here are my mother and my brothers. For whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and sister and mother. Now that seems, I think just on the surface, sounds a little offensive. If I was his mother and brothers, certainly I would feel it was offensive. I know, for instance, in my wife's life, she had a family in the church, actually more than one family in the church that invested in her, but one that she moved in with, um, and really received a lot of care from them and some maturity that she needed, and stability probably is even a better word that she needed, that she didn't get in her mother's household. But I can tell you, just watching that happen was offensive and hurtful for her mother, despite the fact that it was something that was true and something that was really needed. And so this statement, where Jesus sort of points at other people and says, "This is my mother and my brothers," is sort of on the surface offensive to us. And if our children said this, if our family said this, we would struggle with it. And so there's one of two ways we can handle it as we go through here and try to understand what Jesus was trying to tell us. We can either really sort of take it at face value and therefore maybe go overboard in taking the practice of what Jesus is saying to the extreme that may not be what the intent that he was trying to express was, or sort of conversely, we could sort of dismiss it and say, well, it was for a specific situation, specific thing that he was saying, and they didn't understand what was going on. But I think, especially if we read the context that we find in Mark, I think that we can understand it in a way that helps us rightly understand our relationship with God and how it interacts with our relationships with our family. So that's what we're going to try to do. Remember that you can download a PDF copy of this Bible study at www.abqnaz.org/alive so that you can follow along with us as we study this text. And number one says, what did we talk about in our last study in the book of Matthew? A, impure spirits and what they do. That's true. B, the importance of filling our lives. Our house is the metaphor he uses with the Spirit of God so that the place is not clean and unoccupied. That's true. And what happens when we don't fill our lives with the Spirit of God? And perhaps that's just another way of stating B. But yeah, that's what we talked about. We talked about the passage which I have quoted many a time because I think it is so appropriate and so important. I see many Christians who've cleaned up their life, but and they may have even cleaned up their life with the help of God, but have not remained filled with the Spirit of God in such a way that their life, their house is occupied. And I see a big problem with that, and I see people falling into their old way of life, the impure spirits that occupied them before, coming back and even bringing seven of their friends. So I think that was an important Bible study. If you missed it, go back, watch the video, because I think it was important, and I had a lot to say about that. Number two, what do we learn is happening while Jesus was still talking to the crowd? So Jesus has been teaching, and as he's teaching, as he's talking to the crowd, we've been in chapter 12 of Matthew for several weeks. Because there was so much depth in it, and we've taken a few verses at a time in many cases, and now we find out that as he was talking, these things that he was saying, something else happened. And what was that something else? According to 12:46 through 47, it says, while Jesus was still talking to the crowd, his mother and brothers stood outside wanting to speak to him. And then somebody told him, your mother and brothers are standing outside wanting to speak to you. And I would just say the expected response is, oh, let me go check on that. Let me go see what is going on. If I was recording this Bible study and somebody came in and said, hey, your family's outside, they want to talk to you, you would expect me to pause the recording, take a break. If my wife called, maybe not if she called once because she might not know I'm recording, I might ignore. But if she called like 3 times in a row, there's probably a fire or something. And so I would pause and say, okay, let me answer my phone. Okay, and you would be all right with that. That was what you would expect to happen. If I was on the stage preaching, um, you might expect me to continue on and maybe somebody else to see if they could help my family with whatever was going on. But honestly, if my wife was being rushed to the hospital, or one of my kids were being rushed to the hospital, if somebody, you know, um, if they were experiencing a crisis, you would not be surprised if I walked off the stage, followed them to the hospital, and Pastor James or Pastor Patty or somebody else, Pastor Bianca, stepped up on stage and sort of continued the service, even if they didn't know what I was going to be preaching on. You wouldn't be surprised if maybe Pastor James stepped up and sort of finished up the point that I was making, because he was following it and obviously listening, I'm sure. Not like some people that would be on their phones. James would not be on his phone. And so he would finish up the point, but then also he might say, you know what, this is the point, but hey, let's stop and let's pray for our pastor. Let's pray for his family. And maybe even more than the point that pastor was making, we need to come together as a body of Christ, as a family. And you would not, the point of what I'm saying is, if all that happened, you would not think, oh, Pastor Pete didn't follow Jesus. In fact, you would say that's expected. And I would say those that were listening to him expected Jesus to respond to his family being there too. I think so. I think that's reasonable. So then the question, how does Jesus respond to this, according to 1248, is sort of, yeah, so I guess one of the preaching formats that I've used before, and I learned in one of my preaching classes, was trouble in the text, grace in the text, trouble in the world, grace in the world. So the idea is, what happened in the world that sort of that is trouble, and how did God uh, work on that? How did God respond to that? So you could say the trouble is mother and brothers out there, and how does God respond to that? And so then in that format, you might assume that his response is grace. and maybe it is. It doesn't. It's not what we would normally define as grace. And then we'd want to sort of apply that to our lives. Um, I would argue that perhaps the way Jesus responds to this is the trouble in the text, and then we have to ask how God is working. But certainly, as I'm teaching, as I'm preaching, this is the statement that creates tension. This is the statement that needs to now be resolved for us. He replied, "Who is my mother and who are my brothers?" Pointing to his disciples, he said, "Here are my mother and brothers. For whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and sister and mother." And so this creates the tension that now we have to break down. And we have to see what the grace in the text is applied to this tension, or how do we respond to this tension? What do we make of this? So what Jesus is doing, it seems, is placing the importance of spiritual family above the importance of physical family. In other words, he's saying that my father, so this is what family looks like to me. You're talking about the mother who birthed me. You're talking about brothers and sisters who we might say are half brothers and sisters because they're children of Joseph, but not born of the Spirit as Jesus was. And you're saying these should take priority. And Jesus says, "My Father is in heaven, and my mother, my brothers, and my sisters, the people who are related to me, are those who are rightly related to my Father." So those who do the will of the Father. So in other words, he's placing the priority relationship that orients him and his thinking about family, not on his earthly mother, father, brothers, and sisters, but rather on the Father above. And so once he places that sort of priority, that this is the orienting priority, this is how I define family, is my relation to my Father in heaven, and therefore everybody else's relationship to my Father in heaven is defines how they are then related to me. So that's what Jesus is really saying. Now, assuming his mother and brothers are people who do the will of the Father, that doesn't have to be controversial or hurtful. And I would say in our lives, one of the reasons that we talk about being unequally yoked, and this is not going to be a Bible study on that, but the scripture says that we shouldn't be unequally yoked. And what that means is that we shouldn't be in binding relationships, contracts, marriages, whatever, with people who don't have the same priorities. And what we're really saying is, if somebody doesn't have the things of God in mind, if somebody doesn't place top priority on the will of God, then there is going to be a strain in our relationship. So the fact that when I married my wife, we decided up front that God comes first, that when we started dating, that was something we really had to settle, is that God's will comes first. What that means is the closer we got to God, the closer we got to each other. Because we both agreed that that's what really matters and that's what really orients us. So I don't feel a tension in my life, in our family, when I do the will of the Father, because my wife is also doing the will of the Father. My kids are also serving God and doing the will of the Father. My mom lives for God and does the will of the Father. When I called them and says, "Hey, I know you paid a bunch of money for me to go to engineering school, but I'm leaving all that and going into ministry," my parents were not upset. You know why? Because they do the will of the Father. And so when they heard that, I was so confident that that was the will of the Father. If I had not been confident, they may have had a longer discussion. But I was so confident that we had prayed together as a family, and this was the will of the Father, that there was really no discussion, and it never created a wedge between us. Um, that being said, we all know, and some of us have experienced what happens because we've seen it in either in our own lives or in the lives of people around us. What happens when somebody's family is not following God? When obedience to God, obedience to the Father is not their orienting priority, then all of a sudden we're at odds because I'm going to do this because I feel like God's called me to do this, but now that creates stress in our relationship because you're not on board with what God wants. And so all you're thinking about is how this impacts you, and you're upset because you're concerned about you and not about what God wants. And so that's where there is a disconnect. That's where this becomes an offensive situation. Number 3, does Jesus really not know? So he says, who is my mother and brothers? Does Jesus really not know? Is it the dementia? Um, I work with folks. It's probably not a laughing matter if you have somebody that you love that's gone through this, but I work with folks with dementia constantly. They don't know things that they should have known, like who their mother and brothers are. Well, actually, many of them remember their parents more than they remember their children, unfortunately. Um, and anyway, that's a whole different thing. Maybe that's something I shouldn't have brought up, but it's kind of like, did he forget? Like, if we're from the outside looking in, not being there, not understanding, did he forget? That's what this question is really about. Did he forget? No, he knows. He is he is making a point by saying who are they, and then saying, I believe these people are my mother and brothers, not the people that you're saying are coming after me right now. So what was Jesus' point according to 12:49 through 50? He's saying the people that have the things of my Father in mind are my actual mother and brothers, and not these people. Now that being said, could they be one and the same? Well, they sure could. In this situation, are they? Well, that's where Mark sheds some light, I think, on this. And we're going to get into that in the next question. So the third part of this question, though, says, do we see our spiritual family this way, or do we give special preference to family even when they don't do the will of God? So before we even sort of get the context of Mark, processing that, and I'll give some examples. Um, so we had one of our youth leaders years ago, um, we were electing NYI president, and this is a example I use a lot because they said, well, my son wants to be why can't we consider my son as for the NYI president? Can he be on the ballot? And I said, well, I've been to your son's Facebook page, and he's smoking a joint, and there's weed smoke coming out, and he's using words that start with a B that are disrespectful to women, and so that's not what we want in our spiritual leaders. That's not what we expect in the NY president, which is a board member. That's not, so my, like, for me, that was an obvious no. That was a no way. That person doesn't come anywhere close to um, qualifying for that position of leadership within the church. And then my second thought was, why in the world would our youth leader think that it would? Well, maybe she hadn't been to his Facebook page. Maybe he was hiding that. Kids tend to hide things like that from their parents, maybe. Um, or maybe she was thinking more about her relationship with him as his mother than she was about honestly assessing his spiritual state. Um, I love my kids. I think in a lot of ways they far exceed the spiritual state that I had when I was young. when I was their age. I don't believe they're perfect. I don't believe that they've got it all figured out. I don't believe any teenager does. Um, but I try to be balanced in the way that I look at them and assess them. And if there was something like that in their lives that I knew about, no way would I appoint them to any type of leadership. They are in leadership in the church because I'm not aware of anything like that going on in their life. But if I was made aware of it, then I would certainly put obedience to God, both my obedience and their obedience, above the favoritism of blood family, if you will. So number 4 says, why, according to 3:20 and 21, were his mother and brothers actually there? So this is what sheds some light. So this text says, then Jesus entered a house, and again a crowd gathered, so that he and his disciples were not even able to eat. Ah, man, that's quite a crowd. Have you ever been in quite a... Well, I mean, I don't know what that means. I don't know if that means there wasn't enough food and they put themselves last. So for me, in a church event, the visitors eat first, the members of our church eat next, and I usually don't eat, honestly, for multiple reasons. One, because I wait till last, and I even let people have seconds before I go, because I can always go get food at home or go buy food or whatever. And I feel like it's not fair or appropriate for me to be eating before other people that may have need or that I would rather show preference in that situation. It's also true that I feel like I'm hosting everybody, so I'm walking around talking to people and things like that, and it's wonderful to be able to sit down and eat with somebody sometimes, but in many cases, sitting down and eating with one or two people means that I can't get around to visit with 30 people that might want to talk to me or feel left out if I didn't, go around to talk to them. So I just a lot of times don't eat. So I don't know if that's why they weren't able to eat, if there wasn't enough food, if the ministry was taking priority, so they were deferring and Jesus just wasn't eating. I don't know. But I understand that feeling. I've been in that sort of situation. When his family heard about this, they went to take charge of him, for they said, he is out of his mind. So, in other words, for him to not care for his own needs is so foreign to our thinking as humans. For him to put others above his own needs, for him to put ministry above his own needs is so foreign to us as humans that his family thought he was out of his mind and went to take charge of him. And basically what that means is they were going to I mean, I don't know if they were going to admit him to an asylum, or if it just meant they were going to take him home, make sure he got fed. If he's not going to care for his needs, we're going to care for his needs. So it doesn't sound selfish in that it seems like they wanted him to be cared for, not themselves. But in the end, their thinking was more that he should be caring for himself instead of being selfless and putting these people that need his touch first. And so that was what was going on. A, they thought he was crazy. That's true. B, he was doing the will of God to the detriment of his own well-being. That's true. And C, he probably wasn't doing normal and healthy things like spending as much time with them as he used to. Now, that could be a selfish thing, and I put that in there. Maybe that's true. It doesn't say that, but in my experience in ministry, that has been a big concern for a lot of people. You know, you can never come to our family events because you always got something going on at the church. You can never, we can never have Sunday dinner the way we used to because there's always a meeting after church or whatever. This is what we like to do. This is what we miss that we used to do, and we can't do that anymore because of this commitment you've made to put other people first and put God first. And so then family comes in and says, we there's something wrong with you. You're not taking care of yourself. You're not paying attention to us the way you should. Number 5, is it possible that God would call us to do things that might seem out of the norm and make us seem to be neglecting our own health or our family? I think he would. And I think he does, and I think he has, and I think he does right here. And I think God calls his own son to submit himself to the rulers and go to the cross. So to say that God would never expect us to do something detrimental to our own health is to ignore the cross, is to ignore Jesus' existence entirely, to ignore him crying out to his Father, sweating drops of blood, and yet saying, "Not my will, but yours," and God's will was that he suffered. And so I would just say that modern Christianity is more like self-help and we need to be healthy and blah 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 than it is we need to obey God. And so that's where I think this text is really important for us right now. Do we believe that God can take care of our health and our family if we obey him? Yes, no, explain. Let me go back to another example. Go back before Christ. Go back to the book of Daniel. Think about the 3 Hebrew children who wouldn't eat from the king's table because those were things that were forbidden for them to eat. And instead, they ate only vegetables because the meat that they were being served was unclean. And so they ate only vegetables, and they challenged the king and said, "Hey, let us do this for a period of time, and if we're unhealthy, then you can make us do whatever you want." But at the end of that period of time, they were more healthy than any of the other people that were eating everything from the king's table. So God took care of them. And so, at what seemed, at least to the worldly standards of that place and time, it seemed like it was detrimental to their health. That's why the king would not want to let them, is because he wanted them sharp. He wanted them on their game. They were basically slaves. They were in captivity, and he wanted them to be able to perform at optimal capacity. And so that's why he thought they should eat appropriately, and they challenged it and said, "We want to eat like this because this is how our God has called us to eat, and see if we don't turn out more healthy." And so we need that sort of trust in God, and we've lost that sort of trust in God, I think, in American Christianity. I know people that say, well, I can't tithe. God wants me to take care of my family. I got to pay my mortgage. I got to pay this. I got to pay, and I would just challenge you, if that's what you think, do what God says and see how He blesses. Um, Honestly, I've heard all sorts of things, and I could stretch it. I could say, what about there's people over the years. It's funny. We had problems years and years ago. People would leave before the closing session on Wednesday night because it was past their kids' bedtime. And I get it. Our kids have had, uh, you know, early on an 8 or 8:30 bedtime, and years ago before COVID. Remember, if you don't remember, we got done with church. We started at 6:30. We got done with at 8:30, which means we weren't home till at least 9, and that was a challenge. And our kids were more tired on Thursday, and it was harder to get them up. But I believe that God has blessed because we made that a priority. Nowadays, we start at 6. That was an intentional choice coming out of COVID to start at 6, even though some people struggle to get there after work sometimes, because we wanted to help parents be able to get home maybe a half hour early. And people still leave sometimes before the closing session. And people still sometimes won't come at all because they want to make sure that their kids get to bed on time. And I would challenge you, I would say that I bet there are days when your kids stay up later than um, than 8 o'clock or 8:30, and that is not really the reason. It's just a good excuse. Um, and Even if that is really the reason. Okay, I won't call your integrity into question. Even if that is really the reason, um, is it possible that God could take care of your kids and they would be better off in the long run because you've chosen to put God first in obedience in this situation? And I would say at this point, I can't speak for the future, but at this point, I believe my kids are better off because we've made that a priority and they've seen that as a priority in my life and they've made it a priority in their life too. Um, so there, we're going to keep going. Number 6, does this give us an excuse to ignore our health and our family when he hasn't called us to? Perhaps when we are being selfish and actually acting out of selfish pride or self-gratification, etc. And I would say, no, obviously, this does not give us an excuse. So I know pastors who've gotten divorces. I know pastors who have lost their family, and it was because their family said, well, hey, you know, we need you home more. And you say, well, you're asking me to choose between ministry and the church. And they spend, 4 or 6 or 8 hours on the golf course every week. And I would say, no, they're not asking you to choose between ministry and the church. They're asking you to choose between the golf course and the church. If you spent that 8 hours that you were spending out on the golf course, that's probably not a good example for our church because we don't have money to be out golfing. But some pastors, that's the truth. They're out on the golf course. For some pastors and for some, you know, I'm just so blown away sometimes. Um, I used to play video games all the time when I was a kid, but um, some of those video games, like back in the Command and Conquer and Wolfenstein days, some of those video games took so much time, and I would sit there on the computer for so long. And when I went to college, I stopped playing video games because it took me more time to do homework, and I would have failed out of college if I'd have kept playing video games at that level. And then I got out of college and I got a job. And sometimes I've had 2 jobs and I have a ministry, and there is no way I could devote the time to video games that I devoted to them in high school. And my Google thinks I'm talking to her. I don't even know what she's saying. So anyway, I don't know if you could hear that either. But so some people play video games. Look, I play board games. I was told I needed a hobby. During COVID, I picked up a hobby. Maybe I went overboard. I don't know. I played board games. I play board games sometimes on my phone, so you could call me a hypocrite. Well, you just say you don't play video games, but you play something on your phone. You play board games, whatever. Okay, sure. But I set down that if I'm talking to my family, if I need to pay attention to my family. And honestly, the board games, the physical board games, a big part of that is playing games and spending time with my family. And so that's why one of the reasons why it was such a great hobby to pick up is it's one that gives me time with my family. So I'm not the one to decide for you. You just got to know, are you really having to decide between family and ministry, or are you really using ministry as an excuse not to pay attention to your family when you could and you should, and maybe there's something else that you could cut out? How do we tell the difference? It's hard from the outside. Honestly, it can be hard because I don't know everything that God's telling you. I don't know what things that you've said you would do that weren't really God's call at all. I don't know. I sometimes have an idea of what I think God's calling people to, and I've seen people make decisions to protect their family that I really felt like was not the call of God, and they were stepping out of the will of God. And sometimes I think that's borne out in what happens in the long run. But ultimately, that's sometimes discernment from God that I'm confident in, but sometimes it's just my own thoughts and judgments. The only real way to tell the difference is, have you heard from God? Do you know what God is saying? Because that's what's important. Jesus had the sort of relationship with the Father that we don't call into question the decision that he was making. We know that he knew the will of the Father because he was intimate with the Father. Not as confident about that with some of the folks I interact with that call themselves Christians, follow after Christ. Um, so we need to get there to where we know what God is saying. Number seven, ultimately, what does Jesus put the importance on according to our Matthew and Luke texts? He puts the importance on obedience to God. That's first importance, always obedience to God. And the people that I'm rightly related to that are really my family are the people that also put obedience to God first. So where do you place importance? Is it on obedience to God, or is it on thinking that you know how to protect your family best? Um, and are you willing to disobey God because you think that this you know the best way to protect your family? You don't. I don't. I don't have a clue how to be a good parent. The only reason I've ever been a good parent at all in the times that I have been, and that's probably not always, is because God gave me direction and I obeyed God. So if you think you know how to protect, that's all worldly wisdom. You don't know. You need to follow God. You need to listen to God. That should be your first importance.